Welcome to this evening's event, Universal Basic Income and Christianity, hosted by the Basic Income Conversation. My name is Major Nick Coke. I'm a Salvation Army officer based in Southwest London in Rains Park Community Church, where I lead the church alongside my wife. Couple of just basic housekeeping things. I'm sure you're all very familiar now with using Zoom. You've probably done it many times before. But we'd be very grateful if you could please stay on mute. Everybody will be muted apart from the person who's speaking. There will be a chance later in this event to ask some questions, and there'll be an opportunity at that point for a few people to be able to unmute to ask their questions. But we'll let you know when we get to that moment. This meeting is also being recorded, just so you know, and that's just an opportunity for people to watch this later. So if you are watching this later on the recording, you are also welcome to be part of this conversation, and glad you're joining us. So just a little context setting for this evening. Universal Basic Income has received a lot of attention in recent months, and we've noticed a lot in the media, but it's not a particularly new idea. It's actually been around a while. And a year ago, my church in Rains Park, we had our own conversation about basic income and our faith. And I have to say, it was one of the most interesting conversations I've had for a long time. We had an hour set aside to talk about it, and it very rapidly turned into 2 hours because I couldn't shut everybody up because people were so energized by this conversation. That won't happen tonight, don't worry, we will finish on time, so that will be okay. But I think it just proves the point that this is a subject I think lots and lots of people are particularly energized by and wanting to talk about. And so that's what we're going to be doing this evening, an opportunity to reflect on what is basic income, also to look at it from a biblical and theological angle and think about how it intersects with our own Christian traditions. And the hope is that at the end of this, we'll have an opportunity to take this conversation further to where we are and in the places where we live and the people that we know. So that's the point of what we're doing this evening. So we have two main aims. One is to get a better understanding of what universal basic income actually is and how it relates to Christianity. And secondly, to be inspired. We've got some great speakers tonight to be inspired to take this and widen this conversation out with others. So the format of the event this evening will be that we're going to start with some short presentations for about half an hour, and then we're going to move straight into a Q&A session where there'll be opportunities for you to submit questions and an opportunity to ask our panel to respond to those. So if you do want to ask a question, this is how we're going to do it. We've got the chat function in Zoom, and I'm going to invite you at any point during this meeting, you can submit a question. And please submit it and choose when you go into that chat to particularly choose the option which says Compass Online, and that's Michael. So Compass Online, and Michael is going to be looking at the questions, and he's going to be submitting those and making that work for us later. So make sure you choose him. That works as a sort of private function that only he can see it. So as a first thing we can all do together, we're going to have a go to poll. We're going to see where we are with this issue right now. So we're going to put a question up. It's going to come up on your screen. I want you to interact with that. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident would you be starting a conversation with friends about basic income? So 5 is very confident, 1 not confident at all. Okay, so 5 is very confident, 1 not confident at all. So you have another 20 seconds or so to fill out that poll. How confident would you be starting a conversation with friends about basic income? Okay, well, results are in. We didn't even get a chance for a drum roll. Our answers are that 4 is the highest percentage. On 30% of people feel sounds like quite a confident group, but some in the middle there, and some at the top and tail of that. So some of you might be like me, where you certainly don't feel like you're an expert on this subject, and you've got some way to go in trying to understand a little bit more about this issue and being able to have a broad conversation with a group of people about it. The plan is tonight that we're going to help. So we're interesting to see if that poll changes towards the end. We're very fortunate tonight to have with us somebody who is probably the person who knows more about basic income in the UK than anybody else. So I'm going to introduce you to him, and he's going to speak to us. Reverend Dr. Malcolm Torry. He's been the director of Citizens Basic Income Trust for over 25 years until his retirement this year. And within that time, he also managed to squeeze in being a Church of England vicar. No idea how he managed to do all that. He was doing that in Greenwich. And he's going to share with us on the subject, what is basic income and why it's a Christian idea. So over to you, Malcolm.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen with you all. I hope this works. There we go. I hope you can all see that. Well, what is a basic income? That's the most important thing to get hold of this evening. It is an unconditional income for every individual that is not conditional on anything at all. It's not affected by your income, your wealth, your household structure, your employment status, or anything else whatsoever, except
Malcolm, sorry to interrupt, Malcolm, we can't see your screen. I don't know whether you're able to reshare that, just so we can make sure that we can. Right.
Is that working now?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Well, let's go back to that then. You can now see what I've just been telling you. Basic income is an unconditional income for every individual. It doesn't depend on your income, your wealth, your household structure, your employment status. It will be different for people of different ages, but it means that everyone of the same age will receive exactly the same amount of money. The basic idea of basic income is always exactly the same. It's always that, an unconditional income. However, it's important to get into your minds an important difference, and that is the difference between the idea of a basic income and the idea of a basic income scheme. The basic income would never be implemented on its own, and you'd need to decide what the levels would be for each age group, how the existing tax and benefit systems would be changed, and how often the payments would be, a lot of different details. And the importance of that is that the basic income is always the same definition, but there are an infinity of different basic income schemes. You may well see arguments against basic income. Always ask yourself, is this an argument against a particular basic income scheme that wouldn't work, or is it an argument against the idea of basic income? I'll leave that with you to think about. You might want to bring that into the questions later. Basic income would always have the same effects. It would be a secure layer of income. It would be better for social cohesion than what we've got now. There'd be absolutely no stigma attached to it. It'd be simple to administer. It would not contribute to marginal withdrawal rates. What that means is that means tested benefits, if you earn extra income, then your benefits are withdrawn. You might get practically nothing out of your additional earnings. A basic income would never have that effect. You would always get more out of what the extra earnings that you manage to make. The basic income would not interfere with employment market decisions. It wouldn't interfere with your relationship decisions, because means tested benefits, as you probably know, do that. Basic income never would. If you want some reasons for basic income, there's the book to read. There's 101 in that book. I started out with rather more. The publisher told me to cut them. It's a cheap paperback and I recommend it. Different basic income schemes can have very different effects, and that's why you need to be careful about the difference between a basic income and a basic income scheme. And a basic income scheme could either increase inequality or it could reduce it. One basic income scheme might increase poverty, particularly if you funded it with higher taxes on lower earners, or it could reduce poverty. One basic income scheme might impose losses on low income households, whereas another would not, and so on. How would we pay for it? By turning tax allowances into cash payments is the quickest way to do it. And by reducing means tested and other benefits, maybe a slight increase in income tax rates and national insurance contributions would be required as well. That's the quickest way to implement a basic income. If you want a higher basic income later on, and it would have to be later on, then different revenue streams would be required. And there are lots of ideas for that. And you can again bring that into the questions if you want to. This country has a very good track record in research into basic income schemes, feasible ones. And that's my most recent working paper published by the University of Essex. We use the best available research methods called microsimulation and the best available example of that, which is Euromod, housed at the university. And there's the most recent working paper about feasible basic income schemes. If you want a general introduction to the subject, then that's the one to get. That's the second edition of a book published in 2030, All Money for Everyone. And this is the book that came out in 2016. As far as I know, it's still the only book about the relationship between basic income and the Christian faith. And all I've got time for is to tell you about the chapter headings. So I shall do that. Here are the chapter headings. Citizens' basic income, that's another name for basic income. Basic income would celebrate God-given abundance. It will be an act of grace, absolutely free gift, just as God's grace is. The basic income would recognize our individuality. It only goes to individuals, not households. Basic income would recognize God's equal treatment of us. It will provide for the poor. People say basic income is not effective targeting. It is in fact the most effective targeting because it would go to absolutely everybody. There's no reason why the rich shouldn't get it, because you can always charge them extra tax so that they don't end up with more than they've got now. Basic income would never judge. There'd be no sanctions attached to it. It would constantly forgive whatever your lifestyle. It would ensure that workers would be paid for their work, which doesn't always happen now with means-tested benefits. It will be the basis of a covenant because it is an invitation to give generously. It is a generous gift to each one of us. It would be an invitation to give. It would inspire us to be co-creators. It would understand both our original righteousness and our original corruption. It would recognize that we are mutually dependent. It would give us a more just society. It would provide us with greater freedom. It would both relativize and enhance the family, which is what Jesus did. It will facilitate the duty to serve, be welcoming and hospitable. It'll be an act of love. A basic income, it's feasible, desirable, and Christian. So what can we do to make it happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm. That was incredibly helpful. As somebody, as I said earlier, who doesn't consider themselves an expert, I found that really helpful, and already my knowledge is increasing this evening, so that's brilliant. Thanks for that. We're going to now hear from our four panelists who are going to share their own reflections. I've given them each five minutes to share a reflection and to think about how basic income fits with their own Christian tradition. So first up, I'm going to introduce you to Simon, Reverend Simon Woodman. He is the minister of Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church in London. I know Simon a little bit because we work together through London Citizens. This evening, he's going to share a biblical case for universal basic income. So over to you, Simon.
Hello, it's good to be here and good to see some familiar faces on the Zoom links coming up. A few weeks ago, I posted a link about universal basic income onto my social media stream, and a friend who I respect came back to me with an interesting response. They said that they were not sure that UBI is biblical. Their point was that God's provision should be matched by a corresponding expectation that people undertake work in response, and that the biblical injunction to stewardship negates an economy based on the free gift of money. Well, this approach certainly has a long tradition within Western Christianity and Western society, with the influence of the Protestant work ethic embedding in our collective consciousness an emphasis on hard work and discipline and frugality. Comments from a number of sources within the mainstream denominations suggest that my friend is not alone, and that there are substantial suspicions about whether UBI is something that can be supported from a Christian perspective. So I thought it might be interesting to explore a biblical model that might support the concept of a universal basic income. And I want to offer two key concepts for our consideration. On the one hand, we have the wilderness experience of the Israelites as they fled slavery in Egypt on their way to the promised land. And on the other hand, we have the words of Jesus. So let's start there. It was to disciples facing uncertain economic futures that Jesus taught the prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," Matthew chapter 6, verse 11. And there is an urgent simplicity to it when it's heard in a subsistence context. But what can the stark simplicity of a prayer for daily bread say to a world where investment banks and food banks sit side by side? Well, in the background to Jesus' prayer for daily bread lies the story of the manna, which sustains the people of Israel in the wilderness. Deuteronomy chapter 8. The Lord your God humbled you by letting you hunger, then by feeding you manna, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. If you remember the story, when they collected too much or tried to keep more than they needed, it went rotten by the next day. And I think this ancient story from the wilderness wandering of Israel can offer us a parable of transformative economics. Because here we have a story which speaks of simple living, where enough is enough, where unnecessary accumulation is pointless, where rest is sanctified, and where people experience contentment because they have sufficient resources to live day by day. It's significant that Jesus quoted from the manna story in his own wilderness experience of hunger, as he responded to the tempter's invitation to turn stones to bread. The instruction to pray each day for daily bread is not some ritual to get God to give us what we think we need. Rather, it's a prayer that takes us into solidarity with those who lack, and which drives us into action to see the hungry fed, the poor raised up, and the impoverished released from the snares of debt. It's a prayer that takes us into works of transformative economics. It certainly did for the early Christians, as they redistributed food and resources across their community so that no one went hungry or in need. And I wonder, in our complex, interconnected, globalized, capitalist world, what such actions might look for us. On the one hand, we might become advocates for good employment practices, where people are paid a fair living wage, receive paid holidays, sickness benefits, maternity cover. But on the other hand, we might find that the prayer for daily bread draws from us a commitment to alleviating food poverty. And so I think we come to the idea of universal basic income as an alternative to the current cruelties of our social security system, a daily allowance given with grace, sufficient to live each day with dignity. This surely is what manna from heaven might look like in our time, as the prayer for daily bread is answered in the lives of those who would otherwise go hungry.
Thanks, Simon. Really powerful stuff. Thank you. That's really, really helpful and really interesting. There is actually a link that's going to go into the chat. So if you didn't catch everything that Simon said, or you want to chew on it a little bit more, there is a blog post which covers some of what he was sharing, which has just gone into the chat there. So you can read up on that afterwards. We're going to move straight on to our second speaker, but just before I introduce her, we're still after questions. So if you have a burning question that's already come into your mind, please write that up into the chat and send it to Compass Office, and they will be looked at there, ready for us to ask our panelists later. So straight to our second speaker, and I'd like to introduce you to the Reverend Karen Webber. And Karen is one of the directors of Basic Income UK and a Methodist minister in South Yardley, Birmingham. Karen has been an active supporter of basic income for a number of years and has done some work with her congregation on this. Karen, can you share a little bit about that and how you think basic income intersects with your faith? Over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all today. So, yes, I'm Karen, and I'm a Methodist minister based in Birmingham. I serve on the board of Basic Income UK and also co-founder of the UBI Lab Birmingham. I first heard about Basic Income UK through my involvement with Citizens. One of my organisers, Becca, who was an organiser at the time, she introduced me to this concept, and instantly it just made total sense to me. And if I had to explain why it made sense to me, it's probably largely because I'm just a working class girl, really. I was raised on a council estate by parents who struggled to make ends meet from week to week, who never had enough for any of life's luxuries. And that's a story that plays itself out continually in the communities that I serve and that I travel alongside. My dad was a strong trade unionist, a philanthropist, and I always remember him saying to me, "Karen, remember this, there is no one better than you, but you, my darling, are no better than anyone else. Always treat people with respect. Always treat people as an equal, and never ever be afraid to challenge injustice." And for me, the injustices that I find in our world, the inequalities, that just the gap, the widening gap between rich and poor, is just a travesty in our world at the moment. For me, basic income is deeply rooted in that need for equality and for people to flourish as human beings. And in my head, in order for people to flourish, everyone should have enough. But I realised when I first came across this topic that I was on a journey, and journeys have to start somewhere. So after I heard about this concept from Becca, I began my journey, and that started by really doing some listening with my family and my friends and my churches. At the time I had two. And I just wanted to get a feel for what people thought and felt about this concept. And initially, what I got back was, well, that'll never work. And then gradually, people would come back to me after a couple of weeks of thinking, and they'd say, "Oh, I've been thinking about that, and I don't know, it seems to resonate somehow." But one of the arguments that people used to put against it, give for against this idea, was, well, people won't work, they'll be lazy, they'll spend it on booze and fags and alcohol. So I started to preach about this and this idea of a basic income, and I started handing out for fake blank checks with £200, this fictitious this amount, and I asked people, if you were given that amount of money each week, what would you spend it on? And write that on that check. And people wrote things like, well, I'd spend a bit, I'd save a bit, I'd give a bit to charity, I'd help my family. And no one wrote anything selfish on those checks. So we started to ask ourselves the question, if we didn't respond selfishly, then what makes us think that anyone else would? And then we went a bit further and we thought, and anyway, what gives us the right to pass judgment on what others might spend their money on anyway? Now, I could tell you lots of stories, but I'm just going to tell you one short story about one of my members, and I'll tell you this story with his permission. It's a story about Mark. Mark is a member of our community. He experiences schizophrenia. His condition is managed really well, and 4 months prior to me meeting with him on this particular day, he'd started a new job and all was well. But at the time, he was caring for his elderly parents who also had mental health problems and physical ailments. And they were needing some extra care. And Mark was finding it increasingly hard to keep his head above water. And his GP was really worried that this extra stress on him would interfere with his medication, and that that you know, he would hit real problems. So she decided to sign him off work, and that resulted in him, you know, losing his job consequently. And I sat with him in a coffee shop for 3 hours, talking through his problems and what he needed. And he was currently waiting for universal credit to kick in. He got rent to pay and bills to pay and food to buy. And, you know, for any of us, that would be stressful. But for Mark, this was incredibly dangerous for his well-being. Now, as a church, we could give him support, and we did. And he also received support from our food bank. But it's just one story of, you know, just how the system just does not work, and it's broken. One of my big heroes in theology is Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was an advocate for the basic income, or as he put it, a citizen's dividend. And he said that the global poor are currently being oppressed by the rich and the powerful. And I just want to read to you a little bit that he wrote about on the sermon, on the story of the Good Samaritan. Because I think in church we're really good at being good Samaritans. We're good at trying to solve people's problems. And I want to just read what Martin Luther King wrote in one of his sermons at Riverside Church. He said, on the one hand, we're all called to be the Good Samaritan on the roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day, we must all come to see that the whole of the Jericho Road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion, King says, is more than flinging a coin at a beggar. It is not haphazard or superficial. It comes to see that a society which produces beggars is one that needs total restructuring. And so I think King felt that this idea was necessary in order to both create equality and eradicate poverty. And King said, I can't, or is coined to be said, he quoted, can't think who quoted, I think it was John Donne, was it? I cannot be who I am meant to be until you are who you are meant to be. And you can't be who you're meant to be until I am who I am meant to be. So this is sense of equality. And theologian Luke Bretherton said, this makes a huge transition from charity to justice, because charity says you don't have, so let me just give something of what I have. But justice goes deeper, and justice says you don't have, but let me look with you at why that has happened, why that situation has happened. Let's see how that's come about. What's preventing you from having in the way that I have? And what can we do together to change that situation? And what can we do together to transform the Jericho Road so that not just you are not living in poverty anymore, it's about generations that come after you. So for me, it's about equality, human flourishing, but it's about making that transition as Christians from charity, offering charity, to actually works of justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Karen. Really helpful, and I love the way you rooted that in your own experiences and communities. So thank you. Please keep sending questions in, and we look forward to asking some of those in a moment. I'm going to introduce you to our third panelist, and we have with us this evening Dr. Eve Poole, who is the Third Estates Commissioner of the Church of England, one of the most senior lay leaders in the church, and is a prolific author on theology and leadership. She recently wrote a piece that appeared in the Church Times on universal basic income. So Dr. Eve, could you share with us some of your reflections on why we need a basic income? Over to you.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you on the call are recent converts to UBI, but I should confess that I've had a bit of a Damascene conversion about it. I was brought up in a village in Fife in Scotland, and very Presbyterian background, which is all about no such thing as a free lunch and all that stuff. And the idea of just handing out free cash was sort of anathema to my upbringing. So I'd always admired UBI as a sort of clever technical solution, but I'd never really believed in it. And I want to tell you why I come to you tonight totally converted and champing at the bit to get this put into public policy. And it's because a number of years ago, the Archbishop of Canterbury kicked off a big project about debt that you may remember. And it was when he was in the middle of his war on Wonga. And they'd done quite a lot of analysis into why is it that households get into so much debt. And they discovered by an analysis of these payday loans that the average loan that was taken out, let me read this, was £260 lent over 30 days. And I think there'd been an assumption in the popular press that everyone was just trying to sort of bling up and buy Nike trainers and be all trendy. But actually what they discovered was that the money was used for things like seasonal expenditure. So Christmas presents, new school uniforms, new shoes for the new term, and was used for things like broken white goods. So a freezer packing up, a fridge packing up, and also a car packing up, or somebody on a sort of 0 hours contract suddenly not being able to work and there needing to be some money to pay rent and things like that. So very few of these distressed loans were about people being capricious and in hoc consumerism. They were about serious problems in being able to live your life. And what that consultation showed was that if most families had about £300 in their savings, then they would be able to weather those kinds of storms. And that got me into thinking, how on earth would we ensure that families never needed to get into debt in the first place? And how on earth, looking at the food bank statistics, could we get rid of food banks? And I was asked by the Jubilee Centre to look at household debt in the era of coronavirus and what should policy responses to that be. And that took me straight back to this conversation I had on Wonga and thinking about the £300 we all need to have in our bank accounts to weather the storm, and thinking about how much worse that's got at the moment. While there have been fantastic rent holidays, payment holidays on mortgages, payment holidays on bills, that's not really a holiday, because there's this ghastly cliff edge hanging around at the end of the summer where people come off furlough, redundancies will kick in, there'll be a massive debt bill to service, and it'll be game over for so many families. And it occurred to me that the only way we can save this nation is through universal basic income. So the traditional charges that have been levelled at UBI are in two main camps. One of them is about moral hazard, and one of them is about the political irreversibility of that kind of manoeuvre. How could you ever be a government that would take that away once you'd implemented it? So let me talk about the first one first, moral hazard, because that's, I think, where Christianity really kicks in. So if I go back to my upbringing in Scotland, in my wee village where, you know, we all had to work hard, no such thing as a free lunch. You know, there was this idea of the sort of undeserving poor and indolence and idleness and all this kind of very Victorian moralising. And I kind of get that as a gut feel. I think an awful lot of people I've spoken to who object to UBI haven't got further than that. They just have a sort of visceral reaction about skivers and scum, and they can't kind of get beyond that. But if as a Christian you think about that, you think we are a religion of universal love, of extraordinary, unconditional love, where we have the incarnation, we have the crucifixion, we have Easter morning, and none of that is contingent on our desert, but it is all about our dignity. So it felt to me that when I examined my conscience about my gut feel about, do they deserve free handouts? What will they do? I was really ashamed of myself. And I thought we really need to hear Christianity in this, not just old-fashioned Freudian moralizing about drives and naughtiness and original sin, but that real sense that why would we not be this loving? What would actually stop us? And in fact, one of the things that we find that is a massive barrier to UBI is this concern that there will be skiving and bad behaviour and everyone's spending on drugs and stuff. One of the bishops said to me, the reason that they don't want it is because they know it will work. Because when we started giving handouts to heroin addicts, they didn't spend it on drugs, they spent it on education, housing and getting out of the problems they were in. So we know that human nature is not as black as it's painted, and UBI would therefore not be as dangerous as everyone supposes. And we know this now for a fact because the most extraordinary experiment has just occurred with the furlough scheme. So the government has been handing out massive amounts of free cash to have people sit at home and not work. And has there been an outbreak of people nipping into their fairly deserted neighbours' houses and looting them and mugging grannies? Have we seen a massive uptick in drug abuse and random vandalism in the dead of night? No. We've seen extraordinary good behaviour in communities and people really loving each other. So I think we have a really good political window to make the argument that the data augurs well. And the other argument I said, apart from moral hazard, is this thing about political irreversibility. And I think UBI has a hill to climb on that front. But at the moment, a year, a pilot connected with COVID, that should be very doable. Because on the basis of the government's job retention scheme, we should be able to argue for a year, very clearly bounded, very clearly researched, where we could do universal basic income, whatever we call it, citizen stipend or something that doesn't sound like money for nothing for the Tories, that is designed to show and test these assumptions about recalcitrance, about waste, about indolence, about all these things, which are not, frankly, very Christian, but I can understand where they come from. Because then if it did show that there was some bad behaviour within that one-year pilot, we would actually have the data to interrogate that, to understand if there was a better design. But it feels to me, particularly as a Christian, that there is now no barrier to UBI. And in fact, it should be our Christian duty to be lobbying for it really, really hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Brilliant, really, really helpful. And you may have noticed in the been posted into the chat is Dr. Eve's article, which if it was in the Church Times, which you can take a look at as well afterwards. We're coming now to our final speaker, last but certainly not least. And so I'm going to introduce you to Father David Stewart. David is currently the parish priest at St Ignatius Church in Tottenham, North London. He specialises in Ignatian spirituality and is a regular contributor to the US Jesuit America magazine. Some of you may have recently heard or read that the Pope has spoken in favour of basic income. So David, it'd be great to hear from you and hear your reflections on how basic income relates to Catholic social teaching. Over to you. We can't hear you at the moment. If you're able to unmute, please.
Sorry, is that okay? It muted itself.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, good. Okay. Thank you, Nick. Let me begin by just saying I'm not actually the parish priest. I work in the parish, just in case the real parish priest is watching. I'm a Jesuit. I'm an interested non-expert. I'm also a Scot. And I've noticed with interest that in my native land, UBI has been discussed a little more than in England recently. I come to this session this evening thinking about the tradition of thought and doctrine in the Roman Catholic Church known as Catholic Social Teaching, or CST. More on that in a moment. As I said, I'm a Jesuit. So is Pope Francis. So I'm particularly interested in what he has to say. But we've also seen that his own background and life story has led him to a deep and vibrant critique of globalization and the pursuit of unrestricted growth. He has often spoken of his desire for, in a lovely phrase, a globalization of compassion. He has told the story of when, behind the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel when they elected him Pope, and it was becoming obvious that his name was on the top of the list, his great friend, the Cardinal from Brazil, leant over to him and said, "Never forget the poor." And when we saw him take the name of Saint Francis of Assisi, many people's favorite saint, we should have guessed it. Saint Francis is loved by the Italian people as Il Poverello, the little poor man. And so back to CST. We use that word teaching, but we're not talking about a rule book here. This is thought, social thought, designed to inform consciences, not to replace them, as Pope Francis has said elsewhere. A major strand of CST has been what we sometimes refer to as the universal destination of goods, the idea that the goods of creation are for all. CST has three pillars: human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity. This tradition of thought, of reflection on social problems, the social question, if you will, begins in 1891 under Pope Leo XIII, as the Industrial Revolution and political upheaval swept Europe. He published the great document, Rerum Novarum, of new things. There's not time to go into its 6 major themes, but it's worth noticing its subtitle, an encyclical, a letter on capital and labor. And in the very first paragraph, this remarkable document talks of, and I quote, the enormous fortunes of some few individuals and the utter poverty of the masses, end quote. This was 1891. Since then, over 20 papal documents and other major pieces of writing have continued this tradition of reflection and thought. And now I'd like to make a direct link to what Pope Francis has been saying. Key here to understand that this is the church at the service of the world, as Pope Francis proposes, not the church seeking to dominate the world or to discover some imagined lost Christendom, as some would like. And now a proposal. Francis's truly extraordinary document of 5 years ago, Laudato Si, while not explicitly suggesting UBI, is, I'd like to propose, oriented in the same direction. Secondly, he makes it clear that he wants us to read Laudato Si as a Catholic social teaching document, standing in that same tradition that began in 1891. And since that tradition has been so concerned that social justice and economic affairs be shaped by the common good, I suggest further that a key insight of Francis in this great document can help our reflection today. And that is his concept of integral ecology. In basic terms, that means that our care, or our lack of it, for the common home is intrinsically connected with our human ecology, our care for each other, or the lack of it. And so to conclude, reading Pope Francis here would suggest that our Christian reflection on UBI should not be separated from our care for the planet. Can we, for example, link UBI, as some have suggested, to the Green New Deal, or to our Christian conversation about the common good and justice? I don't know. You tell me. I say that it is worth discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Father David. Another fascinating reflection. Okay, so we've had four different reflections, 4 different traditions. Really appreciate what you've shared. Thank you to all the speakers. We're going to move straight to our question time. We've had some questions come in. And how we're going to do this is that we've selected a few of them in the time we've got available. Sadly, we won't be able to get through all of them, but we've got some. So we're going to, if your question has been selected, we're going to call out your name and then we invite you to unmute yourself and to ask the question. But please just stick to the question that you've asked. We're not looking for lots of extra stuff. Just if you could share your question, and then we have a chance to get through more questions. And also to the panelists, if we could answer them fairly briefly, that gives us a chance to look at more and more of the questions. So, Michael, who you've been collating the questions, I wonder if you have a first question for us. Who is it?
Yes, we're going to hear from Virginia Moffat. Would you like to go first, Virginia?
Thank you. Thanks, panelists, for great reflection. It's really good to see all the different traditions, including my own Catholic tradition at the end there. My question is, as Christians, we're encouraged strongly to care for our children, for our elder parents or disabled relatives, but often that comes at great expense and cost to us. So when I was a mother, I had to give up work to care for my children at home. And I know many people who've gone into poverty caring for their relatives. So isn't a strong argument for Christians to champion UBIs means that it helps us do those fulfill that Christian function?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm going to come to Eve. If you would like to respond to that, that would be great.
I once had a fight at a dinner party with a vicar, and he wanted to take me on about how badly paid he was. And I had a strange conversation because, as far as I understood it, the whole point about vicars' stipends in the Church of England is it's supposed to be a subsidy to allow you to exercise your vocation so that you don't starve while you're doing it. And that's why I would vote for this to be called a citizen stipend, because it's about how can we subsidize everyone to be a normal person? And we should be allowed to care for our elderly relatives, our children. We should be allowed to do all these things which are so crucial for society without having to go to a food bank. And so I would totally agree with you. The thing about UBI is it is so blessing of our fundamental dignity and our role in the community. And that's why I think it'd be politically attractive, because I think the one thing we've learned from lockdown is that we have a huge capacity to be community spirited and community minded, but we had a very commercial deal with the state. And actually this would be a way to reset that, to say we want you to be a human being first and foremost, and then anything else you want to add on top of that. So I would totally agree with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Father David, would you have anything to add?
Just to thank Virginia for that beautiful comment, and what immediately comes to mind when I hear her speak is the quotation from Pope Francis earlier about the globalization of compassion, and to expand the quotation, I've not got the exact words in front of me, but he talked about responding to the globalization of indifference, which is what he sees when he looks around the world, with this globalization of compassion. And that would mean that if compassion is our primary motivating factor before legitimate economic factors, then in many ways the whole picture would change, our whole attitude would change, because we're putting, as some of my colleagues in the panel have already suggested, we're putting the unconditional love of God for creation first and foremost, and letting all our decisions from there on flow from that. So thank you, Virginia, for that really beautiful comment.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to a second question. We're going to go to Sonia Barker. So Sonia, if you could unmute and share your question for us.
Fine. Oh, I will unmute. Right, yes. What I've put here is, are we all affected, more than we realise, by the Victorian concept of deserving and undeserving poor? And how do we challenge that within ourselves and others with regard to UBI? For me, I'm a Methodist, the tradition that I worship under, but I was also teaching at a Catholic church, Catholic school in Norwich when the lockdown occurred. And we have a food bank based at the Methodist church, and we did have until late last year. And I think people internalise these views, these judgments, which Karen mentioned earlier, which I think we don't even know or realise how much we internalise this. So we jump to judgment. The other thing that's awful about it, from my point of view, is that people judge themselves. They censor what they want to do, and that poverty, it's not just a poverty of finance, it's a poverty of aspiration, so that young people and families don't dare do things because they haven't got the money to let them out of that. They imprison themselves. And to me, that is one of the worst things. And the other thing, which I found dreadful, was that people were ashamed to come in to claim, if you like, their food bank food. And we had to give them bags to sort of hide it up. And I just thought, what on earth is going on here? So they had internalised that Victorian. They felt they did not deserve the charity they were being given through the food bank, which led me to think that this is why UBI is so good. It's not just a poverty of the finance, it's emotion, and it shames people into feeling that they are not worthy. And that is appalling.
Thank you for that reflection and question. Karen, can I come to you to respond to that first?
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. I heard the word Methodist and I thought, I'm going to get this one. Yeah, the deserving and the undeserving poor, that's an interesting one. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in there, and a lot of the feedback or the pushback I got, or I do get, is, you know, I work hard for what I've got. Why should somebody get that for nothing? So yeah, I think it's about maybe changing that narrative and challenging that narrative and questioning that narrative. There's also a question there about equality for me as well. You know, specifically in relation to food banks as well. And I think food banks, by the way, they're a response. They're not a solution. They don't create a sense of equality and empowerment. And I think you're right there. But you know, we often say as Christians, well, we're created in God's likeness. We're created male and female in God's likeness. It's this sense of equality that we take from that. But if we, you know, with this sense of equality, yeah, we might say that, and we might say, yeah, we're all created equal, but we have to accept we're all created equal, yeah, but we weren't created with the same gifting. And I think that is, and so then some have more, some have the ability to generate more. Does that make sense? And others don't. So what is the responsibility for those who do have this ability to generate more, for those who don't? You know, and that's a question that I'm still milling around as well. But I think for me, it's about how do we create a sense of equality where everyone can flourish and be who they are meant to be, whatever that might be.
Thank you, Karen. I know Eve is very keen to make a brief response as well. So over to you, Eve.
Sonia, I'm so with you, because this is what I hear. I hear this kind of crap thing about undeserving poor, and that's exactly why William Temple did the whole thing about the welfare state, which is there should be nobody who does not have justice and does not have dignity. And I think it's based on some really dodgy psychology that we've all absolutely swallowed. I wrote separately about capitalism around kind of Freudian idea about, which in theology is about original sin, which is all, we're sort of dirty and recalcitrant and we need sorting out. And I totally agree with you. I think that's just wrong. There was a fascinating article recently in The Guardian about, we all studied, I think, at school, Lord of the Flies. And we assumed that if you sent a load of kids off to an island, they would just all kill each other. And that was a given. We've all been taught that at school. Anyway, they found a group of kids who did end up on an island somewhere in the South Seas, I think, who didn't do that at all. They'd all actually gone to a Catholic school, I think. They used to get up in the morning, they used to do a little religious ritual, they had rules about everything. When they were rescued 18 months later, they were living in a very healthy community. They weren't killing each other at all. So I do think there is a time for us as Christians to rehabilitate and rebaptize anthropology, which is we're not all nasty, dirty skivers who are going to take the mickey. We're made in the image of God and we all deserve love. We really do. So I totally agree with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So for our next question, I'm going to read it out. It's from Jim Ogilvie, and they've been asked me to read it. He's actually from my church as well. So hi, Jim. Good that you're here tonight. The question is, does the panel consider that the parable of the talents is comparable with the concept of UBI? So that's the question. And Simon, over to you to see what your response is.
Wow. Yeah, I did consider the parable of the talents. There is a slight difficulty around how we interpret it because it appears in two Gospels. You have the parable of the talents in Matthew and the parable of the pounds in Luke, and they seem to convey slightly different messages about what's actually going on and what the relationship between Christianity and a sort of moneyed leader should be. The Lucan version, the parable of the pounds, I think is quite subversive. I think that one is very much saying that the king is not God. The parable of the pounds in Luke is suggesting that the king who is handing out money and expecting people to work on his behalf is actually the mechanisms of the world that we live in, and the one who hands back the money unused because they've refused to play that money-making game and is then killed for it is Jesus. Now, I admit that's not the Matthew one, but the two stories are clearly the same story in two different Gospels. So I think we have to be a bit careful about not reading either of those stories as kind of deifying some kind of mechanistic approach where God gives us money and expects us to work jolly hard on his behalf and give him a good return, or else we're going to get it. I think there are other ways of reading those stories which are far more subversive of that kind of system. So I'm a little bit suspicious about using those as a kind of critique of money making in return for stuff.
Thank you. Brilliant. So we have time for just one more question, and this one is from Kevin. And this is the question: are there any consequences for being a bad steward within UBI? Are there any consequences for being a bad steward within UBI? I wonder if David or Karen might like to respond to that one.
Well, I think the short answer, Nick, is no, I wouldn't like to respond to that one. Because I claimed earlier not to be an expert, and I haven't quite worked that out yet. But I think there is something to link to what we've just heard from Simon about the notion of how should we use the talents that God's given us. Yes, I agree. The biblical story, New Testament story, is thoroughly subversive. I found myself remembering a situation some years ago when I worked in a Jesuit secondary school, not so far from where I am just now, as a teacher and chaplain. And I remember the example of one lad who came from a single-parent family, not terribly far from this part of London, who somehow managed to turn up to school every morning, reasonably well presented, got a grade one, I think it was one grade G at GCSE, a Key Stage 4, and yet we were able to point to this lad as being a very good example of making the best use of his talents and getting that one grade G. I realized that when I had to pay a home visit to his home, and the circumstances in which he was trying his best were just horrendous. And it was a miracle that he even got to school in the morning, let alone with all the noise and drug dealers and all these sort of things to survive. So were there any sanctions against him? I think those sanctions would have come from his own sense of himself as he was growing up and realizing that the best way that he could be everything that he was meant to be was by using the talents he had as well as he could. And when this story was presented sometimes to prospective parents at the school, it became extremely subversive. So yes, perhaps I'm developing an idea here that there is as the theologian Metz would say, there are subversive memories all around us, and we should pay attention to them.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have in time for our questions this evening, but really appreciate that from all of you who sent questions in. And that just shows the level of this conversation. There's so much more to say, right? So we want to take this conversation on. Hopefully that's given you a little taste of what we can start to talk about together. And now I'm just going to hand over to Michael Pugh, who's the director and co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation. And he's going to talk to us about how we can take this conversation forward. So over to you, Michael.
Oh, I'm unmuting myself. Thank you so much, Nick, and everyone for being here this evening. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see that slide. It was a fascinating discussion. I'm Michael Pugh. I'm the director and co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation. I'm a community organizer by background, having worked for Citizens UK, where I worked with lots of faith organizations over the year, and that's where I met Nick, Karen, David, and Simon. Part of my desire to set up the Basic Income Conversation was so that we can get civil society talking about the idea, and I hope tonight can be the start of a much bigger conversation within the Christian community about basic income. But now I'm going to share with you a little bit more about how you can get involved with that, because there were some questions on the chat about how do we make the case, how do we get the government of the day to do this. Quickly, who are we at the Basic Income Conversation? We are a new initiative supported by the think tank Compass. We have the very simple belief that everybody deserves the means to live, and basic income is the best way to achieve this. But we want to hear from you. We want to check if people agree with us, if we've got that right. So we have three main aims. We want to identify an impactful and winning narrative that puts people at the heart of how we talk about basic income. We want to support a diverse coalition of individuals and organizations who can scale a powerful movement for basic income to happen. And we want to build the credibility and understanding of the idea. And we think the best way to do that is through conversation, hence our name. But for too long, the conversation about basic income has largely been by academics and politicians. But thanks to the work of our partners, the UBI Lab Network and Basic Income UK, who I believe are on the call this evening, basic income is rapidly moving from the fringes to the mainstream of debate. By definition, universal basic income would of course impact everyone. So we think everyone should have their say. So over the coming year, we are starting a national conversation about basic income, a big listening campaign across the country. We'll be partnering with organizations from all sorts of sectors to explore how basic income intersects with things like health, disability, work, climate, gender, technology, and much more. And so tonight, for example, we've explored or begun to explore how basic income intersects with Christianity. And we'll be having more conversations about how it intersects with other faith traditions over the coming months. But the conversation starts with you at home and in your community. We'll be providing training and toolkits for anyone who wants to host their own basic income conversation. You could host a conversation at home with your family and friends, or perhaps after church service with your community, anywhere you want. And so, what do we want to know when we're having these conversations? We want people to discuss why we actually need basic income, especially since coronavirus has struck. We also want to know what people would do if they had a basic income. How would it impact them, their family, and their community? And of course, with an idea so big, people are inevitably going to want to talk through some of the questions and concerns that they might have. So how can you host your basic income conversation? We want to make it as super easy for you as possible. We challenge you to get a room, or a virtual room at least at the moment, of just 5 to 10 people. This, as I said, could be just your family around the dinner table. It could be with some of your friends down the pub or at the park. It could be at the back of church after service, or of course at the moment it will have to be online like we are this evening. All you need to do is pick a date and a venue for roughly an hour like we've done this evening, and we can help you provide the Zoom details. You can sign up to the Basic Income Conversation online to get your discussion toolkit. We'll give you a presentation, some notes and a suggested outline, and we'll also provide an easy way for you to be able to sort of track the stories that you hear. And then have your own basic income conversation. As tonight has proved, it always leads to interesting debate and interesting conversation. But what next? What happens? It's not just a talking shop. We want to make this thing grow. So we want people to pass it on. Once they've attended a basic income conversation, like you have done this evening, can you go away and host your own? If you speak to 10 people and they will speak to another 10 people each, suddenly we're reaching over 100 people and more. So this is how we grow our movement, and this is how we have a national conversation about basic income. What will we be doing with all of these stories that we gather? Well, at the very least, hopefully people will leave each conversation with a greater understanding of basic income, as I hope you have done this evening. But we will also be analysing all the stories that we hear so that it can help us build that impactful and winning narrative that people can relate to and politicians can say yes to. And more importantly, we'll be building a movement of storytellers, that's you, that can take action to take this conversation all the way to the doorsteps of power and decision makers. So if you think you can host a conversation, as I said, even if it's just with 5 friends or family, all you need to do now, and what I'm asking you to do, is to put your name and email in the chat box on Zoom, and we will get back to you with next steps about how you can start the conversation. It's that easy. So put your name and email in the chat box if you want to host one. Don't be shy. And if you prefer to not share your email publicly, just privately message Compass Office on the chat. I think that's all you can do anyway at the moment on the chat function. And so, as I said, all you need to do now, share your name and email. Thanks for those that are messaging now. Keep them coming in, your name and email, and we will get back to you. And if you're listening to this recording, you can sign up online at thebasicincomeconversation.org. And you also have my email there on the slides, which is michael@compassonline.org.uk. So thank you, everyone. Keep those names and emails coming in on the chat, and we'll get back to you soon. But for now, I'm going to hand back to Nick to wrap things up this evening so we finish on time.
Thank you, Michael. That's brilliant, and that's incredibly helpful information on how we can have our own conversations where we are. And I know I'll be taking that back to my church and hopefully to the wider Salvation Army, and we'll get some of these conversations going across the country. So as Michael says, if you want to be involved in those conversations, please just add your details into the chat. So one of the aims I said at the beginning of this evening's event was that we would go away with a greater understanding of basic income, and to see whether our confidence levels might rise in terms of holding these conversations in the future. We held a poll at the beginning, so we're going to hold another poll just now, and let's see what we're saying on the scale of 1 to 5. How confident would you be starting a conversation with friends about basic income? So 5 is extremely confident, 1 is not confident at all. Let's see what we get. I feel like we need to do a bit of a big drum roll for this one. Okay, hopefully everybody's had a chance to vote and the results are in, and we now have 51% are for, which is definitely an improvement. I can't remember the exact stats, but the highest percentage I think was 30% was 3 at the beginning. So we're definitely more confident at the end of this evening than we were at the beginning, and so that's definitely fulfilled one of our aims that we had for tonight. So as we've said a couple of times, we've been recording this session. So if you have others that you would like to pass this on to, then we will be circulating the link, and you can do that by email. We'll also be sending around the different articles that we mentioned, the Church Times article and some of the work that other people have been doing, a chance for you to follow up on reading from tonight. So we've come to the end, and we've come to the end on time, which is even a couple of minutes early, which is amazing, which means that you're going to get a little bit more of your evening than you thought you would. But I definitely want to do a huge thank you to you for coming, but particularly to our amazing speakers this evening. So we need to do a sort of a big Zoom virtual clap, cheer, whatever. You can use the little emotion things at the bottom of the screen if you want the reaction things. But a huge thank you to Malcolm, to Simon, to Eve, to Karen, to Michael, and who have I left off? To David, of course. So, well, thank you so much to all of you for giving us your time this evening and for your brilliant speaking. It's been incredibly helpful. And that just leaves me to say thank you for coming, and hopefully we will see each other again in another basic income conversation somewhere, someplace, and look forward to working together. Have a wonderful evening. Take care and good night.